Hi everyone, welcome. This tray that you see here, it's got my population of so-called mixed worms, and I refer to it as the mixed worm population because there's a variety of worms living in here, supposedly. It's the mix of blue worms and red wigglers and European night crawlers. It's a mix of worms that I believe a pretty good number of people have, and man, there's a good number of worms hanging out here. It's not too surprising. We fed them a bunch of pumpkin and watermelon last time over here. And I would imagine that the moisture kicking off that stuff and then coming up and getting caught on that plastic that was on there and recirculating under there probably made for an environment over on that end of the bin that the worms really favor. So I'm going to uncover the entire system here, remove all these plastic sheets, and then we'll be able to get to the business of checking out the system and giving them their feeding. There's a lot of castings adhering to those pieces of plastic, probably because of what appears to be a lot of moisture in here. This looks like the skin of a tomato. So here we've got the traditional feeding zone indicator. And one thing's for sure, this system has had mites in it for a while now. We've noticed it a number of times, and they're all over the place. You can see these little white specks all moving around. Those are all springtails. So now personally I have no objection to springtails being in my systems. It just seems a bit unusual that this is the only system where I really clearly see them. And I believe that the main reason they'll usually start to show up in great numbers like this is because of possibly high moisture levels. So like I said, I don't have a problem with them being in here. However, there is something I've gotten back into doing recently, which is the application of my, I guess it's mosquito dunks. The generic chemical name for it is BTI. BTI is short for some sort of bacteria name, whatever it is. And the real reason I'm adding the mosquito dunks solution is because I'm after the flying insects that I've been seeing here and there within my wormery in a number of my systems. And the way I understand it, this stuff actually does work on reducing their numbers. So I'm not adding moisture because I feel like there's an absence of moisture. I'm only adding it because of the BTI solution being in this bottle. And I actually did already spray this system down yesterday with a little bit of it, because yesterday I sort of decided it was time to revisit all my systems and start treating them all with the Mosquito Dunks BTI solution, because I was starting to see flying insects in certain systems, and I didn't want to have to pick and choose which systems to put it in. I just went around all my bins, sprayed the stuff in. Then I figured the new regimen would be every time we check in on a bin, we'd actually apply some of it. Look at all these springtails down in here. Wow. I thought we were actually getting fewer of them because I saw so few out on the surface, but it seems like they came in for the they seem to have come for the pumpkin and for the watermelon that was placed in here last time. Man, look at them all. So now, besides a whole lot of springtails, I know I saw a fruit fly somewhere over here. Just sort of appeared for a moment. I think here too I just swatted one with my fingertip. So yeah, hopefully the application of that BTI solution will knock them out as it has done so in the past for me. And I'm just hoping that that wasn't just some sort of coincidence, that I got lucky and then for whatever reason the fruit flies just vanished on their own accord for some other reason. But it did seem to me like when I adopted the use of the mosquito dunks solution once upon a time last year to try to combat the flying insects, it did seem to work. And I think I actually bought that process back a couple times to deal with the situation, and each time it did seem to work. So I'm pretty sure we can anticipate that it's going to work again for us here on this occasion too. But I think one of the collateral damage sort of things that occurs when you put the BTI solution is that other small insects also seem to get reduced in numbers by great amounts. So I think some of my other observations were that I see far fewer mites, and I also assume that that's probably part of the reason I was never seeing many springtails, and that the only reason we're seeing a little bit of a bloom of these little guys is because I had stopped using the BTI after it ran out a couple months ago. Maybe that enabled them to sort of get a foothold in here. And I clearly have way more moisture going on in this system than is needed. I'm almost thinking that perhaps it might make good sense to leave off the plastic coverings and actually give this system a little bit of an opportunity to air out and dry off, because there's really no reason for stuff to be this damp. We don't need to have a springtail breeding ground. As much as I'm sure that the worms enjoy it, we can still have a happy and healthy worm bin with a lot less moisture. So perhaps the thing to do here is going to be to skip the replacement of the plastic coverings and maybe just find a piece of paper to cover up with here at the end. I've got some newspaper and stuff we could use for that, and that does seem to me like maybe a good idea. So, before I disrupted everything, you might have noticed how the stuff on this edge of the bin seems really, heavily worked and pretty much finished, as opposed to what you see on this side, which is all leaves and stuff. It's because the worms living in this environment are already over 150 days old at this point. Maybe 153, I think. They've already had almost a dozen feedings. I think today's feeding is going to be the 12th feeding. And they used to live in a much smaller container, and when I dumped the contents of that container here into this somewhat larger container, I shoved all that over to this side, and that's the reason this end of the bin is a little bit more finished as far as finished castings versus what you find on this edge, which is mostly freshly added bedding and clearly a lot more moisture than we need. Alright, I'm kind of swirling around here because I'm just trying to figure out how to play this here. The stuff that I've got for them is not a very moisture-rich feeding. I've got a whole bunch of potato peels, which are not going to bring with them much moisture, as well as a couple pieces of moldy bread, also not going to bring with them much moisture, and that might be just what the doctor ordered. Feeding again over on this far edge where we've been feeding lately, but with stuff that's not going to add any moisture, not like the pumpkin and the watermelon they got last time. Here and there I definitely saw signs of, leftovers of the pumpkin. I might have even bumped into a piece of watermelon or something along the way, but I figured even if we find some leftovers, it's been 11 days now since the last feeding, I figured even if we saw some leftovers, we're just going to drop in those few pieces of potato peel and a couple slices of moldy bread, and we can also sort of supplement that a little bit with some worm chow that I've got. So since I've also got a replacement coffee filter to become our new feeding zone indicator, we can also bring in the old one that we were gawking at in the beginning with all the springtails hanging out on it. So this piece of paper, I guess we're just going to turn it into supplemental bedding. So I'll tear it in half, spread it out. Then I also bought down a piece of napkin here, or paper towel, or whatever this is. I'm going to drop that down into the feeding zone. Kind of a good thing that it's going in dry. And then we could proceed with the foods. And you might also notice there's a lime in here. Even though I usually, freeze almost everything that goes into my worm bins, that lime was just used as the source of a little bit of lime juice. So I could mix up a quick little cocktail. And it didn't have the opportunity to get frozen like most of the foods that go into my worm bins. So it's the exception, usually not the rule, to just drop something in here that's not been frozen. But I mean, on the topic of freezing and not freezing the foods that the worms get, there was a couple of occasions, a couple bins where I fed with potato peels that were not frozen, and those suckers, they started growing like crazy. So these potato peels went straight into the freezer when I received them from my mom. From this point on, I don't think I'm going to be putting, potato peels into my bins that are not frozen, because they just start growing like crazy. And then I've also got my pulverized eggshell collection here. We're going to dump a little bit of this in here. This doesn't really register as a food item per se. It's more of a grid. The grid is there to help the worms eat their foods. So now we had a number of other pieces of paper that were thrown in here during the last feeding. I think some of the pieces of paper were found as leftovers from previous check-ins, and I think a couple of these pieces of paper actually came in here brand new last week. But I do remember pulling them out along the way. I figured we'd drop them back into the feeding area. This looks to me like a banana peel. And I don't know if I remember seeing much, if anything else, as far as leftovers. Here, I guess we've got yet another couple pieces of paper here. Let's get all this stuff back down into the feeding zone. Then we can start covering up. Oh, here's some more. I must have covered it up as I was excavating the hole. So let's just pick through here a little bit and make sure we put all these things that we want to have the worms focus their attention on. We put it all in here around all the foods so that hopefully the stuff gets work done. Yeah, the stuff on this edge is very heavily worked, but everything on this far edge is all kinds of fresh bedding, newly added bedding. So it's not too surprising that we're finding all kinds of large leaves and stems and paper bits. Man, way too much moisture in here. I think it's going to be definitely a good idea to, leave the plastic coverings off for one go around. I think after I stop filming, I'll make sure I haven't stranded any poor wormies on those pieces of paper over there. I mean, on those pieces of plastic over there, since they're not coming back onto the system. I'll just make sure that any worms that are still stuck to those pieces of plastic get returned into this worm bin before we put it away for good. And maybe we won't even go so far as to cover things up here at the end, so that'll leave me a chance to go fetch a piece of paper with which to cover up here. Get the worms that need to be returned, worms that might be out on the plastic coverings. I'm just thinking there was little unfinished business as far as the feeding goes, right? We were going to give them some of my worm chow, and maybe on this go around we can sort of just apply it as sort of a little dusting on the top of the entire collection of somewhat newer bedding materials that are out here, all these leaves and paper bits and everything. Maybe that'll inspire the worms to come up and nibble on that stuff a little bit. And since things are so damp in here, I think we're going to see plenty of worm action on that stuff, even though there's going to be only paper coverings and things are going to eventually dry out here to a certain degree. Hopefully the worms will have an opportunity to nip off all those pieces of worm chow out on the surface prior to things getting a little bit drier on the surface after we cover up with paper. But we didn't really explore the rest of the bin too much because I guess I got so caught up with the amount of moisture and the springtails, but I'm just curious because I had fed an entire sunflower to these worms, and that sunflower was pretty much getting put right back down into the middle over here. So I like to just pop in on it once in a while and see how it's coming along as far as its breakdown process. Some of these strands here, I believe, are part of the flower, and the worms always seem to be all over it. Definitely enjoying it, but I am a little bit surprised to still see leftovers of it. Perhaps all the pumpkin and watermelon they got last time distracted them from focusing on the on the sunflower. So now maybe they'll get returned, get their attention returned back to that sunflower and polish it off at some point, since maybe the potato and the bread are not going to be as interesting. Although the bread, I believe, is probably something that the worms are going to really enjoy nibbling on. So I don't think that's going to last. And, as long as we've gotten this far, why would we skip checking out the far edge of the bin where all the really broken down material from their old system is from when we moved them over. Here it's almost all castings, a couple little bits of maybe tomato peel, a couple little leftovers here and there, but certainly not much. I don't think it does any harm just to kind of aerate it a bit and stir it up. And then I think we could leave things to be the way they are now. Definitely a lot of moisture in this system. I think it'll be a benefit to allow it to dry off some. And since it wasn't much of a feeding, we'll probably be back in here another 10 or 12 days, sort of like we were today. An 11-day pause after those chunks of watermelon and pumpkin getting put in here. I'm sure if we were to come back in another 10 to 12 days, we would probably see very little as far as leftovers are concerned. So I'm just thinking, yeah, I'll mess with this stuff after we shut the camera off. I think what we need to do is find a suitable covering for this thing, and perhaps this piece of newspaper here, just resting out here on my bench, would work. We'll just sort of loosely place it out on top here. It'll protect against a little bit of drying, but not much. It'll pretty much allow a lot of airflow, a lot of drying, and perhaps by doing that, combined with adding the BTI mosquito dung solution, maybe we'll gradually start to see a reduction in the number of springtails hanging out in the system. Alright everyone, that's it for our check-in with the mixed worms. Don't forget, I'll be checking the plastic, make sure we haven't stranded any worms, so you need not worry. But we're done here. I just wanted to really quickly, before I start cleaning up and putting things away, just wanted to really quickly say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now. You know what? I'm just going to leave this here so I can check the plastic, make sure we haven't stranded anybody. Alright everyone, I'm out of here. Bye.